The crowd's roar died instantly as Marcus Thunder Rodriguez's body hit the arena dirt with a sickening thud that echoed through the Thomas and Mack Center speakers. 23,000 people sat frozen in their seats, watching the champion bronc rider lie motionless beneath the unforgiving Nevada lights. The bay horse that had thrown him, Devil's Canyon, continued bucking wildly near the chutes, as if celebrating a victory that no one wanted to witness. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats." The announcer's voice crackled through the sudden silence, but his usual showman's confidence had vanished entirely. Medical personnel were already sprinting across the dirt, their red emergency bags bouncing with each desperate step. In the contestant area behind the chutes, Jake Morrison gripped the metal railing, so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He'd been scheduled to ride next, 8th in the lineup for the opening night of the 2025 National Finals Rodeo. The culmination of everything he'd worked toward for 15 years now seemed meaningless as he watched paramedics surround his longtime friend and rival. Thunder Rodriguez wasn't just any rider. He was the 3-time world champion, the face of professional rodeo, the man who'd made riding broncs look like poetry in motion. Seeing him lying there, completely still while chaos erupted around him, sent a chill through every cowboy in the building. "Jesus Christ," whispered Tommy Chin, the young rider from California who'd earned his first NFR qualification this year. His face had gone pale beneath his black cowboy hat. Is he breathing?" Jake couldn't answer. His throat felt like sandpaper as he watched the medical team work frantically over Thunder's crumpled form. The arena that had been electric with anticipation just moments before now felt like a morgue. Even the livestock seemed to sense something was terribly wrong. The horses in the holding pens had gone quiet, and the pickup men sat motionless on their mounts. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the event's head physician, was the first medical professional to reach Thunder. She'd been working rodeos for over a decade, had seen countless injuries, but something about the way the rider had fallen made her stomach clench with dread. As she knelt beside him in the dirt, checking for vital signs, the arena's massive video screens went dark. A decision made quickly by event officials who understood that some moments weren't meant for replay. "We need a spinal board here now," she called out, her voice cutting through the hushed murmur of the crowd. Thunder's pulse was weak but present, but he wasn't responding to verbal commands, and his left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. "And get me direct contact with University Medical Center. We're going to need trauma surgery standing by." In the stands, Thunder's wife Elena clutched their 8-year-old daughter Sophia against her chest. Elena had been coming to rodeos for 12 years, had watched her husband get thrown, stepped on, and battered more times than she could count. But she'd never seen him lie so perfectly still. Sophia was crying into her mother's jacket, asking questions that Elena couldn't bear to answer. "Mama, why isn't Daddy getting up?" Sophia's voice was muffled but desperate. "He always gets up." Elena Rodriguez had met Marcus at a rodeo in Mesquite, Texas, when she was 22, and he was a hungry young cowboy with dreams bigger than his bank account. She'd watched him climb from small-town competitions to the professional circuit, had celebrated his victories, and nursed his wounds. She knew the risks, every rodeo wife did, but knowing and witnessing were two entirely different experiences. "He's going to be okay, Mija," Elena whispered, though her own voice was shaking. "The doctors are helping him right now." Down in the arena, the medical team had stabilized Thunder's neck and was carefully transferring him to a stretcher. The process seemed to take forever, each movement measured and precise. The crowd remained eerily quiet, broken only by occasional coughs and the creak of stadium seats as people shifted nervously. Jake Morrison found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Thunder just 2 hours earlier. They'd been in the contestant locker room, both preparing for what should have been the biggest night of their careers. Thunder had been joking about retirement, saying this might be his last NFR if his body didn't cooperate much longer. "Hell, Jake, I've got enough metal in my back to set off airport security from 3 states away," Thunder had laughed, adjusting his protective vest. "Elena keeps threatening to hide my gear if I don't start thinking about what comes after." "After what?" Jake had replied. "You're Thunder Rodriguez. There is no after." Now, watching his friend disappear into the medical tunnel on a gurney, Jake wondered if Thunder had somehow known. If that easy laugh and casual mention of retirement had been his way of preparing for something he sensed was coming. The arena announcer, Bill Henderson, had been calling rodeos for 35 years. He'd witnessed career-ending injuries before, had developed the professional composure necessary to guide crowds through difficult moments. But something about tonight felt different. The silence wasn't just respectful. It was profound, almost spiritual in its intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henderson's voice finally broke through the quiet. "Thunder Rodriguez is receiving the best possible medical care. We're going to take a brief intermission to allow the medical team to complete their work. Please remain in your seats and keep Thunder and his family in your thoughts." As paramedics wheeled the stretcher toward the exit, Thunder's eyes flickered open for just a moment. Elena, who had rushed down from the stands with Sophia, caught that brief glimpse of consciousness and felt her heart leap with desperate hope. "Marcus," she whispered, running alongside the gurney as medical personnel allowed her those precious few seconds. "I'm here, baby. Sophia and I are right here." Thunder's lips moved almost imperceptibly, and Elena leaned closer to catch whatever he was trying to say. The words were barely audible, slurred and weak, but she heard them clearly enough to make her blood run cold. "Can't feel my legs, Elena. I can't feel my legs." The ambulance doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo throughout the Thomas and Mack Center. As the emergency vehicle pulled away from the arena, its red and blue lights painting frantic patterns on the concrete walls, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone present. In the contestant area, 50 of the world's best rodeo athletes stood in stunned silence, each man processing what they'd witnessed in their own way. For some, it was a stark reminder of their sport's inherent dangers. For others, it was a glimpse into their own potential future. But for all of them, it was the moment when the 2025 National Finals Rodeo transformed from a celebration into something else entirely. Tommy Chun, the rookie from California, was openly weeping now. He'd idolized Thunder Rodriguez since he was 12 years old, had studied videos of his rides obsessively, had even copied some of his signature moves. The man he'd hoped to compete against for the next decade might never ride again, and Tommy wasn't sure he wanted to climb onto his own horse anymore. "What happens now?" he asked Jake, his voice cracking with emotion. Jake Morrison looked around at his fellow competitors, saw the fear and uncertainty in their faces, and realized that someone needed to step up. At 34, he was one of the older riders, had been on the circuit long enough to understand that rodeo was about more than individual achievement. It was about brotherhood, about honoring the sport and the men who'd built it. "Now we do what Thunder would want us to do," Jake said, his voice carrying across the group. "We ride. We ride for him, and for everyone who came here to see what we're made of." But even as he spoke those words, Jake felt doubt creeping into his mind. How could they continue after what they'd just witnessed? How could they climb onto those same broncs that had just potentially ended Thunder's career? The questions had no easy answers, but the show, as it always did, would have to go on. The arena crew had already begun raking the dirt where Thunder had fallen, erasing the physical evidence of the accident, but unable to remove it from the memories of everyone who'd witnessed it. As maintenance workers smoothed the ground and reset the chutes, the brutal efficiency of professional sports became apparent. There would be 8 more rides tonight, 9 more nights of competition, and a world championship that still needed to be determined. Dr. Mitchell returned from the medical tunnel and approached the group of waiting contestants. Her face was professionally composed, but Jake could see the concern in her eyes. "I can't give you specific details about Thunder's condition," she said, "but I want all of you to know that he's receiving excellent care. University Medical Center has been notified, and their best trauma specialists are standing by." "Doc," Jake interrupted, "just tell us straight. Is he going to be okay?" Dr. Mitchell paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's too early to make any definitive statements. What I can tell you is that he was conscious when we loaded him into the ambulance, and that's a positive sign. Beyond that, we'll have to wait for the hospital's assessment." The riders nodded, understanding that she'd told them as much as she could under the circumstances. Medical privacy laws prevented her from sharing more, but her carefully neutral expression spoke volumes about the seriousness of Thunder's condition. As the arena slowly came back to life around them, with maintenance crews completing their work and event officials conferring in hushed tones, Jake found himself facing the biggest decision of his career. He was scheduled to ride in less than 20 minutes, on a horse called Midnight Storm that had thrown its last 4 riders. The rational part of his mind was screaming at him to withdraw, to live to fight another day. But the deeper part of him, the part that had been shaped by 15 years of rodeo culture, knew that walking away wasn't an option. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bill Henderson's voice filled the arena once again, "we're ready to resume competition. Our next rider, representing Montana, is Jake Morrison on Midnight Storm." If that story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. The crowd's energy had shifted dramatically from the electric anticipation that had filled the Thomas and Mack Center earlier that evening. What remained was a subdued tension, 23,000 people collectively holding their breath as they watched Jake Morrison climb the chute rails above Midnight Storm. The black gelding shifted restlessly below him, sensing the heightened emotions that seemed to permeate every corner of the arena. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he worked his rope around the horse's girth, making the adjustments that could mean the difference between a successful ride and following Thunder Rodriguez to the hospital. Every movement felt deliberate and weighted with consequence. The routine he'd performed thousands of times now carried the burden of proving that rodeo could continue, that what had happened to Thunder was a terrible accident, but not a reason to abandon the sport they all loved. "You sure about this, Morrison?" asked Luis Valdez, the experienced rider from Texas who was working as Jake's helper for the evening. Luis had been competing at the NFR for 8 years and had never seen the arena atmosphere so charged with anxiety. "There's no shame in taking a night off after what just happened." Jake paused in his rope work and looked down at Luis. The question was fair, and Jake had been asking himself the same thing since Dr. Mitchell had returned from the medical tunnel. But backing down now would send a message to everyone watching that Thunder's accident had broken something fundamental in the sport. It would suggest that fear was stronger than the dedication these men had spent their lives building. "Thunder would ride if it were me lying in that ambulance," Jake replied, testing the tension in his rope one final time. "Hell, he'd probably ride if it were him lying in that ambulance." Luis nodded, understanding the logic even if he didn't entirely agree with it. Rodeo had always been about facing fear head-on, about proving that courage could overcome the most dangerous circumstances. But tonight felt different, as if the usual calculations of risk and reward had been fundamentally altered by the image of Thunder Rodriguez lying motionless in the arena dirt. In the stands, the crowd watched Jake's preparations with an intensity that bordered on uncomfortable. Conversations that had resumed after Thunder's injury died away again as people focused on the chute area. Many spectators were wrestling with their own conflicted emotions, wanting to see great rodeo but feeling guilty about their desire for entertainment after witnessing such a serious injury. Elena Rodriguez sat in a private box with Sofia, having returned from the hospital after ensuring Thunder was stable enough for her to leave his bedside temporarily. She'd promised him she would watch the rest of the competition, that she wouldn't let his accident cast a shadow over the entire event. But watching Jake prepare to climb onto another dangerous horse, so soon after her husband's fall, was almost unbearable. "Mama, is Uncle Jake going to get hurt too?" Sophia asked, using the honorary title she'd given to all of her father's close friends on the circuit. Her young mind was struggling to process what she'd witnessed earlier, and the sight of another rider preparing to face similar danger was clearly frightening. "Uncle Jake is very experienced, Mija," Elena said, though her own voice betrayed her uncertainty. "He knows what he's doing." Down in the arena, Jake had settled onto Midnight Storm's back and was making his final adjustments. The horse was known for his unpredictable style, sometimes spinning to the right, sometimes launching into high, twisting bucks that had unseated even the most experienced riders. There was no way to prepare for what the animal might do once the chute gate opened. Jake could only rely on his instincts and 15 years of accumulated knowledge about how to stay centered on a bucking horse. "Timer's ready when you are, Jake," called out the chute boss, a veteran cowboy named Red Parker, who'd been working NFR for over 2 decades. Red had seen plenty of riders get back on horses immediately after witnessing accidents, but the circumstances tonight were particularly intense. He'd known Thunder Rodriguez for 15 years and considered him one of the finest men ever to compete in professional rodeo. Jake nodded and settled deeper into his seat, feeling Midnight Storm coil like a loaded spring beneath him. The horse's muscles were taut with anticipation, and Jake could sense the animal's eagerness to explode out of the chute. This was the moment when all the preparation and mental conditioning came down to pure instinct and reaction. "Outside," Jake called out, the traditional signal that he was ready for the chute gate to open. The gate swung wide, and Midnight Storm launched himself into the arena with a force that immediately tested every muscle in Jake's core. The horse spun hard to the right, then suddenly reversed direction, a move that caught Jake slightly off balance and forced him to rely on his free arm for stability. The crowd, which had been eerily quiet during his preparation, began to respond with cautious cheers. But something felt different about this ride from the moment it began. Jake's timing seemed slightly off, his usually fluid movements appeared more mechanical, as if he was thinking too much instead of simply reacting to the horse's movements. Midnight Storm, sensing his rider's uncertainty, increased the intensity of his bucking, launching into a series of high, spinning jumps that required perfect balance and timing. At the 6-second mark, Jake was still mounted but clearly struggling. His free arm was working overtime to maintain his balance, and his legs weren't gripping with their usual authority. The crowd, now fully engaged despite their earlier apprehension, was on its feet, willing him to make the 8-second whistle that would mark a successful ride. Tommy Chin watched from the contestant area with growing concern. He'd seen Jake ride hundreds of times, and had never witnessed him look so uncertain on a horse's back. The accident with Thunder had clearly affected everyone, but Jake was trying to push through emotions that might be compromising his ability to compete safely. At 7 seconds, Midnight Storm made his most aggressive move yet, launching into a high, twisting buck that required Jake to shift his weight dramatically to stay centered. But the adjustment came a fraction of a second too late, and Jake found himself sliding toward the horse's left side, his rope hand losing its crucial grip. The 8-second whistle sounded just as Jake hit the arena dirt, a simultaneous moment of success and failure that perfectly captured the complexity of what everyone was experiencing. Technically, he'd made the time requirement for a successful ride, but the landing was awkward, and Jake rolled several times before coming to a stop near the arena wall. For a terrifying moment, Jake didn't move, and the crowd fell silent again, fearing they were about to witness a second serious injury in the same evening. But then Jake pushed himself up on his elbows, shook his head to clear it, and slowly climbed to his feet. The relief that washed through the Thomas and Mack Center was almost palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bill Henderson announced, his voice carrying a note of relief that he couldn't entirely hide. "That's a qualified ride for Jake Morrison with a score of 74 points. It wasn't a great score, certainly not competitive by NFR standards, but under the circumstances, it represented something more important than points or prize money. Jake had proven that rodeo could continue, that the sport was bigger than any single accident, no matter how serious or frightening. As Jake walked toward the chutes, acknowledging the crowd's supportive applause, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at having completed the ride safely, disappointment at his subpar performance, and a lingering anxiety about Thunder's condition all competed for space in his mind. He'd done what needed to be done, but the cost of pushing through his fear and uncertainty was evident in every step he took. Dr. Mitchell approached him as he reached the medical area behind the chutes. "How are you feeling, Jake?" she asked, conducting a quick visual assessment for any obvious signs of injury. "Sore, but nothing serious," Jake replied, though he could already feel stiffness setting in across his back and shoulders. "How's Thunder? Any word from the hospital?" "He's stable," Dr. Mitchell said carefully. "They're still running tests and evaluating his condition. Elena should have more information soon." Jake nodded, understanding that the doctor was limited in what she could share. But the word stable was encouraging, even if it didn't provide the complete picture everyone was hoping for. The remaining riders that evening completed their runs without any additional serious incidents, though the atmosphere remained subdued throughout the rest of the competition. Each successful ride was met with relief as much as celebration, and even the highest-scoring performances seemed somehow diminished by the shadow of Thunder's accident. As the evening session concluded, Jake found himself in the contestants' lounge, a windowless room beneath the arena where riders typically gathered to socialize and decompress after competing. Tonight, however, the usual post-competition energy was notably absent. Men sat in small groups, talking quietly about everything except what they'd all witnessed. Tommy Chin approached Jake's table, still visibly shaken by the evening's events. "Jake, can I ask you something? How do you do it? How do you climb back on after seeing something like that?" Jake considered the question carefully. Tommy was young, talented, and at the beginning of what could be a long and successful career. How Jake answered might influence not just Tommy's immediate future, but his entire relationship with the sport they both loved. "I don't know if I did it right tonight," Jake admitted. "My ride was shit, and I probably shouldn't have been out there with my head all scrambled like that. But sometimes you do things not because they're smart or safe, but because they need to be done. But what if Thunder never rides again?" Tommy pressed. What if this is how it ends for him? The question hung in the air between them, unspoken fears given voice. Thunder Rodriguez had been the face of professional rodeo for over a decade, the rider that young cowboys aspired to emulate and veterans respected above all others. The possibility that his career might end with a catastrophic injury rather than a triumphant farewell was almost too difficult to contemplate. "Then we honor what he built," Jake said finally. "We ride better, we compete harder, and we make sure that everything he gave to this sport means something. Thunder didn't spend 15 years getting the hell beat out of him, so we could all quit the first time something scary happened." Around the lounge, other conversations were taking place that would influence how the remaining 9 nights of competition unfolded. Veteran riders were talking to younger competitors about managing fear and uncertainty. Event officials were discussing additional safety protocols that might be implemented immediately. Wives and girlfriends were having harder conversations about the risks their partners accepted every time they climbed onto a bucking horse. Elena Rodriguez returned to the arena around midnight, after spending several hours at University Medical Center. Her face showed the strain of the evening, but there was also a determination in her expression that suggested she'd reached some important decisions during her time at Thunder's bedside. She found Jake in the parking lot, loading his gear into his truck trailer. The Nevada air was cold and dry, a sharp contrast to the heated emotions that had dominated the evening inside the arena. "Jake," she called out, causing him to turn toward her voice. "Thunder wanted me to tell you something." Jake stopped his loading and gave Elena his complete attention. Whatever Thunder had said, it would carry significant weight given the circumstances of their conversation. "He said to tell you that your ride tonight was exactly what needed to happen," Elena continued. "He was watching on the hospital television, and he said you did what a real cowboy does when people are counting on him." The words hit Jake harder than he'd expected. Throughout the evening, he'd been second-guessing his decision to compete, wondering if he'd been reckless or selfish in climbing onto Midnight Storm so soon after Thunder's accident. Hearing that Thunder himself had approved of the choice provided a validation that Jake hadn't realized he needed. "How is he, Elena?" "Really?" Elena paused, and Jake could see her struggling with how much to reveal. "The doctors are still running tests, but the early signs are challenging. There's spinal cord involvement, and they won't know the full extent of the damage for several days. But he's conscious, he's talking, and he's already asking when he can come back to watch the rest of the NFR." Jake nodded, understanding that Elena was sharing as much hope as she could manage while being honest about the seriousness of Thunder's condition. The next few days would bring more clarity about his friend's future. But for now, uncertainty was the only certainty anyone could count on. As Jake finished loading his equipment and prepared to drive to his hotel, he thought about the conversation he'd need to have with his own wife, Sarah, who was back home in Montana. She'd been watching the NFR broadcast and had seen both Thunder's accident and Jake's subsequent ride. By now, she was probably wondering if her husband had lost his mind, getting back on a horse so soon after witnessing such a serious injury. The truth was that Jake wasn't entirely sure he'd made the right choice either. But in the world of professional rodeo, right and wrong were often less important than necessary and unnecessary. Tonight, showing that the sport could continue despite tragedy had felt necessary, even if it hadn't felt entirely right. Tomorrow would bring day 2 of the NFR, with 9 more nights of competition stretching ahead. Thunder Rodriguez wouldn't be among the competitors, but his presence would be felt in every ride, every score, and every decision the remaining athletes made about how to honor both the sport they loved and the man who'd given it his everything. The University Medical Center's intensive care unit buzzed with the quiet efficiency that characterized serious medical facilities throughout Las Vegas. In room 314, Thunder Rodriguez lay surrounded by monitors, tubes, and the constant electronic sounds that had become the soundtrack to his new reality. 3 days had passed since his accident at the NFR, and the initial uncertainty about his condition had gradually given way to a clearer, more devastating picture. Dr. Amanda Foster, the neurosurgeon who'd become Thunder's primary physician, stood at the foot of his bed reviewing the latest test results with Elena. The conversation they were about to have would fundamentally change how Thunder and his family viewed their future. But Dr. Foster had learned over 15 years of practice that difficult truths were always preferable to false hope. "The MRI results confirm what we suspected from the initial examination," Dr. Foster said, her voice gentle but direct. "The injury to Marcus's spinal cord is complete at the L1 vertebra level. This means there's been a total severing of the neural pathways below that point." Elena felt her legs weaken beneath her, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. She'd been preparing herself for bad news, but hearing the medical confirmation of what they'd all feared was still devastating. What does that mean exactly? Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer. It means that Marcus will not regain feeling or voluntary movement in his legs, Dr. Foster continued. The injury is permanent, and while there are always advances being made in spinal cord research, current medical science doesn't offer any realistic hope for recovery of function below the injury site. Thunder, who had been listening to the conversation with his eyes closed, opened them and looked directly at his wife. The pain medication had kept him somewhat detached from the full emotional impact of his situation, but this moment of clarity cut through everything else. "So I'm never going to ride again," he said simply, not asking a question but stating a fact that needed to be acknowledged. "No, Marcus, you're not," Dr. Foster replied with the same straightforward honesty. "But you're going to live, and with proper rehabilitation and support, you can still have a meaningful, productive life. The injury doesn't affect your cognitive function, your upper body strength, or your ability to be a husband and father." Elena moved to Thunder's bedside and took his hand, feeling the strength that remained in his grip. For 15 years, she'd watched this man face every challenge with unwavering determination, but this was different. This wasn't something that could be overcome through training, dedication, or sheer force of will. "Elena," Thunder said quietly, "I need you to call Jake Morrison. There's something I need him to do." That same evening, Jake was preparing for his 4th ride of the NFR when his phone rang. He'd been struggling with his performance all week, unable to shake the mental images of Thunder's accident or find his usual competitive rhythm. His scores had been mediocre at best, and he was sitting in 15th place in the overall standings, well below his expectations for the week. "Jake, it's Elena. Thunder wants to talk to you. Can you come to the hospital before tonight's competition?" Jake checked his watch and calculated the timing. He had 3 hours before he needed to be back at the arena, enough time to make the trip to University Medical Center and return. Something in Elena's voice suggested this wasn't a casual request. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Jake replied, already reaching for his truck keys. The drive to the hospital gave Jake time to think about what Thunder might want to discuss. Over the past 3 days, he'd been in regular contact with Elena about Thunder's condition, but this was the first time Thunder had specifically asked to see him. Jake suspected that whatever his friend wanted to talk about, it would be significant. He found Thunder awake and alert, looking more like himself despite the medical equipment surrounding his bed. The pain medication had been reduced, and Thunder's mental clarity was noticeably improved from Jake's previous visits. "Jake, thanks for coming," Thunder said, gesturing for his friend to take a seat beside the bed. "The doctors gave me the full story today. I'm never going to walk again, let alone ride." Jake felt his throat tighten. Hearing the words from Thunder himself made the situation feel more final than all the medical updates and speculation that had filled the past few days. "Thunder, I'm so sorry, man. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Thunder replied. "But I need you to do something for me. I need you to win this thing." Jake looked at his friend with confusion. "Win what thing?" "The NFR. The World Championship. Everything that I was trying to win when this happened." Thunder's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I've been watching the broadcasts from here, and you're riding like shit, Jake. You're thinking too much, you're scared, and you're not competing like the cowboy I know you are." The directness of Thunder's assessment stung, but Jake couldn't argue with its accuracy. He had been riding poorly, letting fear and uncertainty affect his performance in ways he'd never experienced before. "It's not that simple, Thunder. Every time I get on a horse, I see you lying in that dirt. I can't get the image out of my head." "Then use it," Thunder said with surprising intensity. "Use that fear, use that image, use everything you're feeling to ride better than you've ever ridden in your life. Don't let my accident be for nothing, Jake. Make it mean something by showing everyone that rodeo is bigger than any single injury, any single rider, any single moment of bad luck." Elena, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, saw something in Thunder's expression that she recognized from his competing days. Despite everything that had happened, despite the devastating news they'd received that morning, her husband was still thinking like a competitor. "Marcus," she said gently, "maybe Jake needs to focus on his own goals right now." "No, Elena. This is bigger than individual goals." Thunder turned back to Jake with an expression of absolute seriousness. "I've spent 15 years trying to win a world championship. I've been close so many times, but something always went wrong at the worst possible moment. Now I'll never get another chance, but you will. You've got 6 more nights to make something happen, and you're talented enough to do it if you stop riding scared. Jake felt the weight of Thunder's request settling on his shoulders. His friend wasn't just asking him to compete better. He was asking him to carry the dreams and aspirations that Thunder would never be able to pursue again. What if I can't do it? Jake asked. What if I'm not good enough? Then you'll fail trying your hardest instead of failing because you were afraid to try at all, Thunder replied. And if you do win, you'll know that part of it belongs to me, and to every cowboy who ever got hurt chasing the same dream. The conversation continued for another hour, with Thunder sharing specific technical advice about riding and mental preparation that he'd accumulated over his career. Despite the circumstances, Jake found himself taking notes on his phone, recognizing that he was receiving insights from one of the greatest riders in rodeo history. As Jake prepared to leave for that evening's competition, Thunder made one final request. When you win this thing, not if, when, I want you to dedicate it to every rider who ever got hurt doing what we do. Make sure people understand that we don't do this because it's safe or easy. We do it because it's who we are. Jake drove back to the Thomas and Mack Center with Thunder's words echoing in his mind. The weight of his friend's request was enormous, but it also provided a clarity of purpose that had been missing from his riding all week. For the first time since Thunder's accident, Jake felt like he knew exactly what he needed to do. That night's competition began with a moment of silence for Thunder Rodriguez, with his image displayed on the arena's massive video screens. Jake watched from the contestant area as 23,000 people paid their respects to a man who'd given everything to the sport they were celebrating. When Jake's turn came to ride, he climbed onto a horse called Desert Storm with a completely different mindset than he'd carried into any of his previous rides that week. Instead of trying to block out the memory of Thunder's accident, he embraced it, using the emotional weight of everything that had happened to fuel his determination. Desert Storm was a rank horse, known for his violent spinning and high-kicking style. But Jake met every move with perfect timing and balance, riding with a fluidity and confidence that had been absent from his previous performances. The crowd sensed the difference immediately, rising to their feet as Jake and Desert Storm engaged in what was clearly a championship-caliber battle. When the 8-second whistle sounded, Jake was still perfectly centered on the horse's back, his free arm high in the air in a gesture of triumph. The crowd exploded with appreciation, recognizing that they'd witnessed something special. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bill Henderson announced as Jake's score appeared on the scoreboard. 89 points for Jake Morrison, the highest score of the week so far. In his hospital bed, Thunder Rodriguez watched the ride on television and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in his friend's performance, sadness about his own situation, but also a sense that his accident might ultimately lead to something positive if Jake could maintain this level of riding for the remaining nights of competition. He did it, Thunder whispered to Elena, who was sitting beside his bed. He found what he needed to find. Elena squeezed her husband's hand, understanding that watching Jake succeed was providing Thunder with a form of vicarious satisfaction that helped make his own situation more bearable. If he couldn't compete anymore, at least he could play a role in someone else's success. Over the remaining nights of the NFR, Jake Morrison rode with a consistency and brilliance that transformed him from a middle-of-the-pack competitor into a legitimate championship contender. Each successful ride built on the previous one, creating momentum that carried him steadily up the standings. The rodeo community rallied around both Thunder's situation and Jake's inspired riding. Fans who might not have paid attention to the bronc riding competition found themselves invested in Jake's pursuit of the championship, understanding that it represented something larger than individual achievement. Tommy Chun, the young rider from California, watched Jake's transformation with fascination and admiration. The veteran cowboy had shown him that adversity could be channeled into excellence rather than simply endured. Tommy's own riding improved dramatically over the final nights of competition, inspired by Jake's example. As the final night of the NFR approached, Jake held a narrow lead in the overall standings, but the championship would ultimately be determined by that last evening's performance. 3 other riders remained mathematically capable of overtaking him, setting up what promised to be the most dramatic conclusion to a National Finals Rodeo in recent memory. Thunder Rodriguez would be watching from his hospital bed, no longer able to compete for the title he'd pursued for so many years, but having found a different kind of victory in inspiring another man's championship run. The accident that had ended his career had somehow catalyzed something beautiful and meaningful, proving that even the most devastating setbacks could be transformed into sources of strength and purpose. The final night of the 2025 National Finals Rodeo arrived with the weight of everything that had transpired over the previous 9 days. Jake Morrison sat in his truck in the Thomas and Mack Center parking lot, staring at the arena where his life had been fundamentally changed just over a week earlier. Tonight, he would either claim the world championship that had eluded him for 15 years, or watch it slip away to one of 3 other riders who remained mathematically capable of overtaking his narrow lead. His phone buzzed with a text message from Thunder Rodriguez. "Win or lose tonight, you've already honored everything we talked about. Now go show them what Montana cowboys are made of." Jake smiled despite his nerves, understanding that Thunder's support had become the foundation of everything he'd accomplished during the past week. The accident that had ended his friend's career had somehow unlocked Jake's own potential, creating a tragic but powerful transformation that neither man could have anticipated. Inside the arena, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had spread throughout Las Vegas about the dramatic championship race, and tickets for the final night had been selling for premium prices on the secondary market. The rodeo community understood they were about to witness something special, a conclusion that would be remembered long after the lights dimmed on the 2025 NFR. Elena Rodriguez sat in the same private box where she'd watched Thunder's accident, but tonight Sophia was beside her wearing a custom-made shirt that read Team Jake Morrison. Thunder had insisted that his family be present for the final night, wanting them to witness what he hoped would be the culmination of everything they'd all endured together. "Mama, is Uncle Jake going to win?" Sophia asked, her 8-year-old understanding of the situation simplified but emotionally accurate. "I don't know, Mija," Elena replied honestly. "But he's going to try his best, and that's what matters most." In the contestants' area, Jake was going through his pre-ride routine with more focus and intensity than he'd ever brought to any competition. Every piece of equipment was checked and double-checked. Every mental preparation technique he'd learned over 15 years was employed. But most importantly, he was carrying the emotional weight of Thunder's dreams alongside his own. Tommy Chin approached him as Jake finished taping his wrist, the young rider's face showing a mixture of admiration and nervousness about his own upcoming ride. "Jake, I just wanted to say thanks for showing us how to do this," Tommy said. "Whatever happens tonight, you've already proved something important." Jake looked at the young cowboy who reminded him so much of himself 15 years earlier. Hungry, talented, and still learning what it meant to compete at the highest level. "Tommy, the only thing I've proved is that we're all tougher than we think we are when something matters enough," Jake replied. "You've got that same toughness. Trust it." The evening's competition began with a special ceremony honoring Thunder Rodriguez, with Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association officials presenting him with a Lifetime Achievement Award that recognized his contributions to the sport. Thunder appeared via video link from his hospital bed, his voice strong as he addressed the crowd. "Rodeo has given me everything I ever wanted from life," Thunder said, his image filling the arena's massive screens. "The sport, the competition, the brotherhood, and the chance to test myself against the best in the world. What happened to me last week was part of the risk we all accept when we choose this life. But it doesn't diminish the beauty of what we do or the courage of the men who continue to do it." The arena fell silent as Thunder continued, his words carrying weight that extended far beyond rodeo into broader questions about how people respond to adversity and setback. To the riders competing tonight, especially those in contention for the World Championship, remember that you're carrying something bigger than individual dreams. You're representing everyone who ever climbed onto a bucking horse, everyone who ever risked everything to chase something they believed in, and everyone who understands that some things are worth the risk. As Thunder's image faded from the screens, the crowd rose in a sustained ovation that seemed to shake the entire building. It was a tribute not just to Thunder's career, but to the sport itself and the men who'd built it through generations of competition and sacrifice. Jake Morrison was the third rider out in the bronc riding, climbing onto a horse called Thunderstruck, a name that seemed almost too appropriate given everything that had transpired. The horse was known for his consistency and athleticism, the type of animal that rewarded good riding but punished mistakes without mercy. As Jake settled into position above the horse, he felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that preceded every ride. But tonight, those emotions were amplified by the knowledge that this single 8-second ride might determine the championship that had motivated every decision he'd made for the past 15 years. Outside, Jake called, and Thunderstruck exploded from the chute with the power and grace that had made him a favorite among both riders and fans. The ride that followed was everything Jake had worked toward throughout his career. Thunderstruck spun and bucked with perfect rhythm, creating opportunities for Jake to demonstrate every skill he'd developed over 15 years of competition. Jake met each move with textbook technique, his free arm marking time with the horse's movements, his legs positioned perfectly to maintain balance and control. At the 4-second mark, Jake was riding with the kind of fluidity that separated good cowboys from great ones. At 6 seconds, the crowd was on its feet, recognizing that they were witnessing a potential championship ride. When the 8-second whistle sounded, Jake was still perfectly centered on Thunderstruck's back, his arms raised in triumph before his feet hit the arena dirt. The judges' score seemed to take forever to appear on the scoreboard, but when it finally materialized, 91 points, the crowd exploded with appreciation. It was the highest score of the entire NFR, a ride that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. But Jake's celebration was tempered by the knowledge that 3 other riders still had opportunities to surpass his total score for the week. The championship wouldn't be decided until the final ride was completed, meaning Jake would spend the next 2 hours watching and calculating, hoping that his best performance had come at exactly the right moment. Luis Valdez, the veteran from Texas, was the next serious contender to ride. His horse, Apache Storm, had thrown its last 2 riders, but Luis met the challenge with the experience and skill that had brought him to Las Vegas for the 8th consecutive year. His 87-point ride was solid but not spectacular, leaving Jake's championship hopes alive. Tommy Chun rode with the fearlessness that characterized young competitors, scoring 85 points on a horse that could have easily ended his NFR with a single mistimed move. As he climbed off his horse and saw his score, Tommy looked directly at Jake and nodded, a gesture that acknowledged the lessons learned and the respect earned over the past 10 days. The final rider capable of overtaking Jake's total was Brad Sullivan from Wyoming, a 2-time world champion who dominated the sport for much of the past decade. Brad needed a near-perfect ride to claim his 3rd title, and he'd drawn Big Bend, one of the most athletic and challenging horses in professional rodeo. As Brad prepared for what might be the ride that determined the championship, Jake found himself thinking about Thunder's words from the hospital. Make it mean something by showing everyone that rodeo is bigger than any single injury, any single rider, any single moment of bad luck. The ride between Brad Sullivan and Big Bend was spectacular, a display of skill and athleticism that showcased everything that made rodeo compelling. Brad rode with championship-level technique, but Big Bend proved slightly more challenging than even his considerable skills could completely master. When the 8-second whistle sounded, Brad had completed the ride, but his dismount was slightly awkward, likely costing him crucial points. The score that appeared on the scoreboard, 88 points, meant that Jake Morrison had won the 2025 National Finals Rodeo average, and more importantly, the world championship that had motivated him for his entire adult life. The arena erupted in celebration, but Jake found himself overwhelmed by emotions that extended far beyond personal achievement. As he walked toward the center of the arena to accept the championship buckle and saddle, he thought about Thunder Rodriguez lying in a hospital bed just a few miles away, watching the culmination of dreams they'd both carried for so long. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bill Henderson announced, "your 2025 world champion saddle bronc rider from Montana, Jake Morrison." Jake accepted the championship buckle with tears streaming down his face, understanding that his victory belonged as much to Thunder as to himself. When the ceremony concluded and Jake was surrounded by media and well-wishers, he made a decision that surprised everyone present. "I need to go to the hospital," he told the event officials. "Thunder Rodriguez needs to hold this buckle before anyone else." The drive to University Medical Center took Jake through the neon-lit streets of Las Vegas, past the casinos and hotels that made the city famous, toward a destination that had become the emotional center of his championship week. He carried the world champion buckle in a simple box, understanding that sharing this moment with Thunder was more important than any celebration or interview. He found Thunder awake and alert, watching late-night coverage of the NFR on television. Elena and Sophia were asleep in chairs beside his bed, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the evening. "So," Thunder said quietly as Jake entered the room, "how does it feel to be a world champion?" Jake placed the buckle box on Thunder's bedside table and opened it carefully. The gold and silver championship buckle gleamed under the hospital's fluorescent lights, representing everything that both men had worked toward for their entire careers. "It feels like something that belongs to both of us," Jake said, lifting the buckle from its box and placing it in Thunder's hands. Thunder held the buckle with the reverence that only another competitor could understand. For 30 seconds, he simply stared at it, running his fingers over the intricate metalwork that designated Jake as the best saddle bronc rider in the world for 2025. "Jake, this is yours. You earned every bit of it with how you rode this week," Thunder said, but his voice carried deep emotion. "But I appreciate you sharing this moment with me. It means more than you'll ever know." "Thunder, I need you to understand something," Jake said, sitting in the chair beside his friend's bed. "I didn't win this championship despite what happened to you. I won it because of what happened to you. You showed me how to turn the worst thing that could happen into motivation to be better than I'd ever been before." Elena stirred in her chair and opened her eyes to see the two men sharing the championship buckle between them. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking, representing everything that rodeo meant to the people who dedicated their lives to it. "Marcus," she said softly, "you need to see something." Elena showed Thunder her phone, which displayed dozens of messages from rodeo fans, fellow competitors, and people from throughout the sporting world. The story of Thunder's accident and Jake's championship run had resonated far beyond the rodeo community, inspiring people who understood what it meant to overcome adversity and find meaning in tragedy. Over the following days, Jake Morrison's championship would be remembered as one of the most emotionally powerful in NFR history. But more importantly, Thunder Rodriguez's accident and the response it generated would lead to meaningful changes in rodeo safety protocols, increased support for injured competitors, and a deeper appreciation for the courage required to compete in one of the world's most dangerous sports. Tommy Chin would go on to have a successful career, always crediting the lessons he learned during that transformative week in Las Vegas. Elena Rodriguez would become an advocate for rodeo safety and support services for families dealing with career-ending injuries. And Sofia Rodriguez would grow up understanding that heroes weren't just the people who won championships, but also the people who helped others win them. As Jake prepared to leave the hospital that night, Thunder made one final request. "Next year, when you're defending this title, I want you to remember that some things are bigger than winning and losing. You've got a platform now, a voice that people will listen to. Use it to make sure that what happened to me leads to something positive for everyone who comes after us." Jake nodded, understanding that his championship was just the beginning of responsibilities that would extend far beyond his own competing career. As he drove back through Las Vegas toward his hotel, the World Championship buckle on the passenger seat beside him, Jake Morrison realized that the most important victory of the week hadn't been his own. It had been the discovery that even the most devastating setbacks could be transformed into sources of strength, purpose, and meaning when people chose to support each other rather than surrender to fear or despair. The 2025 National Finals Rodeo had stopped suddenly on that first night, but what emerged from that moment of crisis had ultimately been more valuable than any individual achievement. Thunder Rodriguez would never ride again, but his influence on the sport he loved would continue for generations through the lives he'd touched and the example he'd set. And Jake Morrison would carry that influence forward, ensuring that championship and tragedy, victory and loss, could coexist in ways that honored both the risks and rewards of chasing dreams that mattered enough to justify everything they demanded. If that story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories.